Welcome to a webinar direct from Arundel House in London, the IISS, and our colleagues in IISS Europe in Berlin. Welcome to this webinar. Thanks for joining on a Friday afternoon. This webinar is intended to launch a report that actually we published about 3 weeks ago entitled Russia's War in Ukraine, Ballistic and Cruise Trajectories, published under our Missile Dialogue Initiative programme. As, of course, everyone has seen over the last 2+ years, there's been a significant use of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles by Russia in its war in Ukraine that's targeted a range of Ukrainian civilian, military and CNI targets. For its part, Ukraine's use has expanded and evolved with Western supply of Western origin equipment, bringing new dimensions of risk for Russian forces in the rear and in Ukraine, deep in Ukraine. I'm joined by 4 paper authors to discuss these issues, looking at the history and doctrine of Russia's use of precision strikes, cruise missile use in the war, ground-launched ballistic missile use in the war, and implications for non-proliferation policy and frameworks. The colleagues who will speak are Zuzanna Gwadera, Research Assistant in the Defence and Military Analysis Programme, Douglas Barrie, Senior Fellow for Military Aerospace at the IISS, Timothy Wright, a Research Associate for Defence and Military Analysis based in ISS Europe in Berlin, and William Alberque, the Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control, also beaming in from the Berlin office. We've got about an hour for this. The speakers will speak for about 5 minutes. Some will have slides, some won't. What I'd ask you all to do, joining us online, is to put your questions in the Q&A function. Just put them in as each speaker is speaking or at the end, that's fine. And I will then take questions and direct them to each panelist. The instructions are just up there in front of you now as well, as we go through the proceedings. So without any further ado, Zuzanna, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. So to really understand and analyze the aims and the performance of Russia's use of missiles in Ukraine, we really want to go back to some of the history and the doctrine of why they acquired conventional precision strike capabilities in the first place, how they say they want to use them, and to what ends. So Moscow's interest in conventional precision strike goes back to the 1970s, 1980s, and to the revolution in military affairs line of thought, which was for the first time since the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons, and that Soviet strategists considered a departure from sole reliance on nuclear deterrence. This, of course, didn't happen in a vacuum. Partially, it was a response to the US developing analogous capabilities and successfully using them. And that shift in developing new weapon systems and an evolution of military thinking, as well as a big overhaul of the Russian military in the early 2000s, eventually resulted in the term non-nuclear deterrence entering the 2014 military doctrine in Russia. And it kind of cemented the role of conventional high-precision strike weapons in Russia's strategic deterrence. And the role of conventional precision strike capabilities is, it sounds quite similar to that of nuclear weapons, really. It is to deter an adversary with a threat of various levels of damage, have different terms for it, from dose all the way up to unacceptable damage, and to de-escalate and terminate a conflict on conditions favorable, acceptable to Moscow. There remain many uncertainties and disagreements about precisely what the relationship is between non-nuclear and nuclear deterrence, and what the advent of long-range high-precision strike means for the nuclear threshold. But how do Russian military strategists actually think about employing those weapons? There are many good studies on this, but generally 2 kind of phases emerge. In the very beginning, the very early phases of the conflict, Russia thinks of conducting initial demonstrative limited strikes. It can be a single strike, it can be a limited group strike on certain key targets to sort of paralyze the adversary and force them to de-escalate. And should that psychological pressure not succeed, then this should be followed by something called SOTSIT, which is the strategic operation for the destruction of critically important targets. And this is essentially a scalable, more grouped, multi-domain operation that requires strikes on critically important political, administrative, economic, and of course military targets. These are still meant to limit civilian casualties, but generally they're aimed to deprive the adversary of some of its critical infrastructure and to force them to de-escalate on Russia's terms. So what have we seen in Ukraine? In the opening days of the war, there indeed has been the very first hours, days of the conflict, there has been a limited strike, not a massive salvo like many expected on some of the critical military infrastructure. This, of course, has not succeeded, as we have all seen, and so the conflict continued, it escalated. But since then, and in the subsequent missile strikes, we have seen a departure really from the stated military doctrine in Russia. And this essentially had to do with the failure to prosecute those key targets with just the intensity required to achieve the level of damage that will deliver those strategic objectives. We essentially have seen Russia use not enough missiles with not big enough warheads. There are obviously other things that have contributed to the potential failure at this departure. We're talking about weaknesses in Russia's kill chain, namely in the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Some weaknesses in its targeting cycle, and of course, among other things, we are talking about the relatively good performance of Ukrainian air defenses, which I'm sure that my colleagues will talk to you about in a lot more detail. Thank you very much.
Zuzanna, thanks very much indeed. Douglas, straight over to you.
Thanks, James. Thank you, Zuzanna, for those introductory remarks. I'll make some brief comments on the use of land attack cruise missiles in Ukraine. I think first thing I would say is that obviously the aerospace forces didn't expect and weren't prepared for a prolonged war. As Zuzanna mentioned, the first land attack cruise missile strikes were piecemeal. I think you can construct an argument that says this was an attempt to have the desired military effect while minimising damage. I think the assumption generally in Moscow was that they would be in charge in Ukraine within a few days. So why destroy critical national infrastructure, which you think you're going to inherit very quickly? The first few months, the cruise missile use appeared low, certainly. If you look at the claimed intercept rates from the Ukrainian MOD, this changes towards the end of 2022, certainly in the fourth quarter, through October, November and December. We see far higher use and the kind of power infrastructure is a particular target set. In terms of kind of overall Russian approach, I think there's a valid question to ask whether or not the Russians were perhaps overconfident in the sense that they had been pretty successful in Syria. It was a very different campaign, but the cruise missiles there seemed to work. And I think that's maybe something we want to explore a little bit in question and answer. Next slide, please, Tom. In terms of the air launch systems, obviously the Ka-101, the successor program to the Ka-55, was the main air-launched weapon that we've seen used, certainly the most advanced in the Air Force's inventory. Obviously, unlike the 55, it comes in both a conventional and a nuclear variant. The nuclear variant in the 102. It's a late 1980s requirement. The range is probably in the order of about 4,000 kilometres, certainly for the conventional version. There is a question mark there about whether that range figure is actually predicated on the original propulsion unit for the design, which was an unducted turbofan, which they actually dropped because they couldn't make it work. And they just went to the same kind of propulsion approach they used on the 55. In terms of guidance, digital, electro-optical, scene matching. Interestingly, the missile itself also seems to have some kinds of defensive aids. Towed decoys have certainly been talked about. Next slide, please, Tom. On the maritime side of the house, the 3M14, like the 101, used pretty heavily. And again, like the 101, probably begins, at least in terms of the requirement, in the late 1980s or early 1990s. It's a follow-on to the Novator 3M10, and like the 101, 102, pretty much comes in conventional and nuclear variants. Both ship and submarine-launched versions have been used in the Ukrainian war. Next slide. Obviously, also ground-launched cruise missiles used, 9M 727, 728, which are INF range compliant, as it were, and then obviously 9M 729, which is range equivalent to the 3M14, so probably 2,500 kilometres. Short range variant, so the 728 has reportedly been used. There's no confirmation that the longer range missile, that's the 729, has also been employed, though it would be unsurprising if it hasn't been. It provides an operational test environment, if you like. Next slide. Now, it's indicative that there remains an issue with inventory depth, as Zuzanna has already touched on, in terms of both the K101 and the 3M14, given that the aerospace forces have had to use the K22, which is an aging weapon. Also, we've seen the 32 used, which is an improved version of the 22, although in far smaller numbers. The 22 is unsuited for precision land attack, while the 32, despite being an upgrade, is perhaps best described as being less inaccurate in the land attack mission. Next slide. The war has also provided the opportunity to operationally test the 9S7760, the Kinjal, although the results so far would suggest further development is required. There is a bit of me wonders if in the Western designation there is in fact still an X in that designation. I'm not sure that this weapon is completely out of test and evaluation, as it were. Next slide. Well, it's been reported that the K555, which is a modified version of the 55, has been used. So far, I certainly haven't seen any visual imagery to confirm this. Obviously, the missile is a distinctive modification to the nose. When you swap out the nuclear payload for a conventional payload, you change the aerodynamic characteristics of the weapon. So it needed these end plates fitted. We just haven't seen it in use, certainly in any imagery. And there's an argument to be made that actually only a limited number were converted, and that these were actually all used in Syria. And of course, this leads to that broader question of what remains, certainly in terms of advanced LACOMs in Russia's inventory, and how it's attempted both to kind of increase or produce at a higher rate the advanced or the modern designs like the 101 and the 3M14, and it's how it's attempted to supplement these. And I think most clearly you can see this in the acquisition of the and licensed manufacture of the Iranian Shahed 136 or the Garan 2, excuse me, as it's known in Russia. And finally, what lessons might Russia begin to draw from the war in terms of where it goes next with land attack cruise missiles? As Zuzanna mentioned, ground-based air defence has proved particularly successful, even if you kind of lower the numbers that the Ukrainians claim to have shot down. Subsonic land attack cruise missiles have proved vulnerable. The Russians, I think, now recognise that they held insufficient numbers of their more modern systems at the start of the war. Again, as Zuzanna mentioned, targeting and battle damage assessment have been inadequate. Next slide, please. And one other area which I think is interesting, probably worth considering, is that Moscow in the past has shown considerable interest in higher speed weapons. The K80 and the K90 both reached flight tests before being abandoned in the 1990s. The K80 is a Mach 3 class weapon. The K90 was Mach 4.5, and possibly there was an ambition to get the weapon to go above Mach 5. Today, there are at least 2 Mach 5 plus land attack cruise missile programs underway, the Ka-41 and the Astrota, although you'll see these described under various other names also associated with these programs. Should these be developed successfully, they're still going to remain expensive, so there'll be an incentive to provide additional inventory depth through the acquisition of less expensive systems to supplement the very high-speed cruise missiles, be these supersonic, subsonic, or indeed long-range direct attack munition follow-ons to the like of the Garand 2. And with that, I'll hand back to you, James.
Douglas, thank you. A lot of questions I've got, at least, from both of those presentations. Now, to test our digital connection, we go to Berlin, to Tim, first of all. Tim Wright.
Thank you very much, James. I do have some slides, and I think they will be popped up. There we are. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do in my section of the presentation is I'm going to talk about ballistic missiles, and I'm going to try to do 4 things. First, I'm going to talk about what ballistic missiles Russia and Ukraine have used in the conflict. I'm also going to talk about how Russia and Ukraine have used ballistic missiles operationally. And then I'm also going to discuss a little bit about their effectiveness and what are some of the early assessments that we can draw from their use so far. So we have 2 images there. The image on the left is, of course, the Iskander-M, which is the principal ballistic missile that Russia has used so far in the conflict. The missile itself, which is known as 9M723, is a single-stage solid-fuel road mobile missile that can carry a warhead up to 700 kilograms, up to ranges up to 600 kilometers. And it utilizes an aero-ballistic trajectory below an altitude of around 50 kilometers, and it can also perform in-flight horizontal and vertical maneuvers at speeds up to Mach 7. And this provides it with some capability to evade missile defenses and also creates interception challenges as well. But despite Russia introducing Iskander with the intention, to replace older equipment, Russia has also used older equipment in this war. And the image that we can see on the right there, that is the 9K79 Tochka-U, also known as the Scarab in NATO parlance. And this system was retired around 2017. It's a Soviet-designed system. It's also single-stage solid fuel, and it has a maximum range of around 120 kilometers. And is equipped with a 480-kilo warhead. And now Russia has denied that it has used Tochka. However, there have been multiple instances where the missile has been seen stenciled with distinctive V and Z emblems, and also been then linked to areas which are clearly in Russian-controlled territory. Now, Tochka, as I'm sure you can imagine, is not as capable as Iskander. Its range is shorter, its guidance and accuracy are far less. But there are multiple overlapping reasons why Russia would choose to use the old missile. This includes reducing pressure on Russia's available remaining inventory of more capable systems, such as 9M723, the availability of large numbers of Tochkas that are in warehouses across Russia, the higher than expected number of Ukrainian targets as well for Russian forces to prosecute and strike, and which are larger than the number of Iskanders or also Lakums that are available to Russian forces. Potentially also to offset the effectiveness of Ukrainian air and missile defensive, both the indigenous systems that they have and also Western supplied ones. And at a more basic, simple level, that using these weapons negates the need for dismantling them. Next slide, please. Douglas has already spoken about this, so I shan't go into too much detail, but of course Russia has also used the Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missile, which essentially is a modified version of the 9M723. It can be launched from a MiG-31 aircraft, and combined with the aircraft, it has a range of a combat radius, of around 2,000 kilometers. Now, this Kinzhal is one of Russia's sort of vaunted hypersonic weapons, to use that term, which some of us dislike intensely. And the first use of it, though, in Ukraine was against an ammunition depot in March 2022. So despite the fact that it's being sort of touted as a weapon that would be very capable of evading advanced air defenses and so on, striking high-value targets, its use in Ukraine so far has seen it striking sites which don't really sort of live up to the type of expectation and the type of target that Russia has described using it against. Air-launched ballistic missiles, just like ground-launched ballistic missiles, of course, present complications and difficulties for air defenses, especially with regards to speed and trajectory challenges. Ukraine has claimed to have intercepted Kinzhal on several different occasions, using the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. And looking at some of the imagery of the wreckage, it does appear that the Ukrainians may have been correct in this assessment. Next slide, please. But of course, it's not just Russia that's using ballistic missiles in this war. Ukraine is also using them too. And I think it's important to reflect on the way in which Ukraine has used and has adapted from a Soviet inventory to one that's also leaning much more Western because of supplies. Now, before the war, the IISS assessed that Russia possessed around 90 Tochka-U launchers. And it used these at the very beginning of the conflict to strike multiple types of Russian targets. On the second day of the conflict, it struck an airfield just inside Russian territory and destroyed several Russian aircraft. And it's also used these to strike other large facilities such as ports, and I believe it sunk an Alligator-class landing ship. But Tochka, as mentioned earlier, has accuracy, serviceability, and production limitations. And Ukraine has requested and has also benefited from Western designed and supplied standoff weaponry. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This includes the M30 guided multiple launch rocket system, which is sometimes called HIMARS, but that's the name of the launcher. And also more recently, the MGM-140 ATACMS, specifically the Block 1 M39 variant. Ukraine has used these systems to strike individual high-value pieces of equipment, logistics nodes, troop concentrations, command and control, and also other high-value infrastructure targets. Now, we've heard the Russian doctrine with regards to its precision strike systems calls for the destruction of critically important economic, political, military infrastructure with conventional weapons. Next slide, please, sorry. Thank you. But despite this, Russia has used ballistic missiles sporadically at the war's outset. Ukraine's National Security Defense Council states that 124 9M723 missiles were used in a roughly 5-month period from February the 24th until the 21st of July 2022. Now, while we need to treat those figures cautiously, footage that we can see of Russian SRBM launches from this period typically show only around 3 to 4 missiles being launched for each fire mission, which may support this assessment. Now, if you think by comparison, on the first day of US operations in Iraq in 2003, a single US Army unit launched 102 ATACMS missiles against a single Iraqi division. And while in 2003, the United States repeatedly struck targets over prolonged periods to ensure their complete destruction, comparatively in 2022, Russia has applied a much lighter touch and failed to repeatedly follow up with targets. If we go to the next slide, please. And this failure to prosecute key Ukrainian targets sufficiently is apparent in satellite imagery that we can see. The Mirgorod Air Base, for instance, which is an important Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter base, which is based in the eastern part of Ukraine, is the image that we can see here. And despite its location very close to the Russian border, Russia only launched a very limited number of strikes that caused marginal visible damage. So the image that we can see here is from the 13th of March 2022, so around 3 weeks or so after the invasion began. And looking at it, there's only very limited amounts of damage that we can see. The red circles indicate craters on the airfields and aprons, but there's lots of other potential targets which haven't been struck. Now, this has allowed Ukrainian aircraft to continue from this particular airfield. It's allowed Ukrainian aircraft to continue operating from this airbase, which has been evidenced by the repositioning of aircraft around the facility. Now, we haven't been able to see some of these facilities for quite some time because the imagery, some of these companies have then decided not to allow imagery. But before that, we could see that aircraft were being moved around, so therefore it's probably quite likely that the airfield was still in use. Russia has also appeared not to strike other significant targets either. So looking, for example, at the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense building, if you look at imagery around 2 weeks after the invasion began, you can see a single crater in the interior of the building, but the building is otherwise untouched. Now, Doug has sort of pointed to this, and a likely reason for the limited number of strikes is because Russia overestimated its own military capabilities and significantly underestimated Ukraine's will to resist. As a result of this, Russian military planners probably believed that large numbers of repetitive strikes were unnecessary, given the expectation that Ukraine would quickly collapse. Next slide, please. Once it became clear to Moscow, though, that its invasion wouldn't be a quick success, the data suggests that Russia increased its use of ballistic missile launches in order to achieve its political and military objectives. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense states that Russia had launched a total of 829 7M23 missiles by 18th November 2022. Now, if these figures are accurate, it would represent a threefold increase in the average rate of missiles launched per month from the February to April period that we looked at earlier. And many of these systems appear to have been used against fixed targets, such as Ukrainian energy and logistics infrastructure, in an attempt to put pressure on Ukraine's civilian population and armed forces. Next slide, please. Now, as mentioned, Ukraine has also used its position-guided standoff weaponry to strike individual high-value pieces of equipment, logistics nodes, troop concentrations, command and control, and other high-value infrastructure. And Ukraine's select targeting of vulnerable Russian assets can be evidenced by its strikes against Russian-occupied Berdyansk and Luhansk airports on the 18th of October 2023. So these two satellite images that you can see of these sites suggest that at least 17 helicopters, including multiple Kamov Kar-52 Hokum attack helicopters, were likely damaged or destroyed in these strikes. Next slide, please. Thinking about have ballistic missiles been effective and what are some of the early assessments that we can draw, ballistic missiles are not a silver bullet. Although there are well-founded calls for this equipment to be supplied to Ukraine, we should not expect them to be a game changer. This is because whilst the introduction of new capabilities may initially be effective, as we have seen in the 18th of October imagery, defenders will react. And thinking of the supply of ATACMS to Ukraine, which has happened after so long of Washington being reluctant to do so, Russia may respond to this by potentially constructing hardened aircraft shelters to protect high-value equipment, or by dispersing vulnerable equipment such as aircraft and helicopters to airfields and other areas which are then beyond the range of ATACMS' 165-kilometer range. As such, we need to think that operators need to choose their targets very carefully for maximum impact. Another thing that we can draw on is that ballistic missiles appear to have some advantages over land attack cruise missiles against air and missile defenses. Ukrainian MOD sources have said that their own and also Western supplied defensive haven't been effective against SRBMs, especially when compared with LACMs. It also stresses the importance of mass fires and deep magazines. Russia had a very large number of targets to prosecute at the beginning of the war and wasn't able to devote enough weapons to each. And also in a war of attrition, magazines run out quite quickly. There's also to recognize the importance of sustained follow-up strikes. Otherwise, facilities can be repaired and reused. And again, looking at Ukrainian airfields, that's pretty apparent. And finally, also the importance of ISR networks and effective kill chains for real-time targeting and battle damage assessment. There's no point having something sharp if you don't know where and how to point it. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Tim, thanks very much indeed. Let me just turn straight then to William Alberque.
Thank you very much. I don't have any slides. I'll just speak from my section on the paper, which focused on implications for non-proliferation policy and frameworks from the war. As you heard throughout the other briefings, the utility of missiles in conflict has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, both sides using a combination of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and uncrewed aerial vehicles to strike targets throughout each other's rear areas. The perception of the utility of missiles in conflict is just incontrovertible. And I believe we're going to see increased understanding that things, for instance, that used to be thought of as artillery, like HIMARS, are actually short-range ballistic missiles. In fact, I read a paper in 2012 that said, since 1990, the overwhelming majority of missile strikes that have been used, something like 95%, had been cruise missiles. But of course, they didn't count the ATACMS, they didn't count HIMARS, which has been used very extensively. So countries are waking up to the idea that ballistic missiles as part of your artillery fires is something that's very useful. So I think more countries are going to be seeking all kinds of different short-range missiles. And by short, I would say up to 1,000 kilometers. One of the other lessons that we see from Ukraine is you have to be able to strike deep into your enemy's rear area in order to be effective. So limiting those missiles to 100 or 200 kilometers might not be as effective. But as Douglas pointed out, cruise missiles, subsonic cruise missiles, like the Kha-101, have proven more susceptible to air defenses than we might have thought. And you think about arms control, Russia relies on the Kha-102 as one of its primary air-launched cruise missiles with nuclear weapons on board. So if it has less faith that the Kha-101 is going to get through, what does that imply for the Kha-102? That's really interesting. In general, though, I think countries are going to be leaning more towards the very, very high-end capabilities. Again, as Douglas pointed out, the very fast, very stealthy missiles are going to be the ones that big countries rely upon for nuclear deterrence and for nuclear strikes. At the same time, the very cheap systems, what Douglas sometimes calls the Radio Shack missile, a missile that's very inexpensive to build and field, or an uncrewed aerial vehicle that's very inexpensive to build and to field, are going to be the things that proliferate in the future. And so how do we handle that? Now, the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Hague Code of Conduct are the two major global systems that we have to try to control the spread of missiles, along with, to a degree, the Wassenaar Arrangement, UN Security Council Resolution 1540 on WMD delivery systems. These are not designed for the very low end of technologies. So the off-the-shelf or the Radio Shack uncrewed aerial vehicle. So for these regimes, since subsonic cruise has shown high vulnerability, and the MTCR is very good at limiting those kinds of systems, should the MTCR be adapted then for very high-end capabilities? And what do you do about the very low-end capabilities? That's going to be, I think, a huge challenge for the missile regimes in the future. Because as the cost of very high-level capabilities comes down, which is an inevitability as we move forward, as the availability of very high-end systems to middle powers becomes more and more ubiquitous, that's going to have huge implications for control. The idea that you could just have the US and Russia get back into INF somehow, it's simply not going to handle the missile threat as it exists today, much less as it's going to exist in 5 years or 10 years. And that brings me to another point, which is the adaptability of designs and target types. Throughout this war, what we've seen is incredible innovation in terms of taking a land attack missile and using that for air attack or sea attack, taking a missile that's supposed to be an anti-ship missile, as Douglas pointed out, the KH-32, the KH-22, using that against land targets. Now, if you actually got into some of these missiles and you changed their optics to upgrade them, it means, as an arms control verification measure, the idea that you could limit ground-launched ballistic or cruise missiles that are used for ground targets in the future is going to become incredibly complicated. When you look at a cruise missile and the modification in order to put that on an aircraft or a land system or a sea system, and then to adapt an anti-ship missile for land attack or air attack, suddenly the categories that we used for the INF Treaty are gone. So this is going to have huge implications for any future arms control, where the idea that you could sequester certain types of missiles or certain ranges of missiles is going to become more and more of a nonsense. The idea that it's just the US and Russia becomes absolutely nonsense. We're going to need a much more holistic view on how we control missiles. And again, do we adapt the missile technology control regime so that it focuses on these very high-end, very destabilizing capabilities? Or do we try to continue to have it to be all things to all people? And with the difficulty in modifying the missile technology control regime due to disagreements among the membership, we have to remember Russia is a member as well, and there have been the importation of political issues into these regimes. It means that controls in the future are going to become more complicated, more difficult. And another lesson from the war in Ukraine is that Russia continues, as Zuzanna pointed out, to target civilian populations, to use missiles in a reckless way, to not really care about collateral damage, whereas in the West, we care very much. What are the implications of that for deterrence theory? Russia's ability to absorb casualties, what is that going to mean for counterforce or counter-value targeting in the future? We're only just starting to learn the lessons. And frankly, as the war goes on, we'll learn more. But in terms of arms control, we're going to have a very difficult road ahead of us. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, William, Tim, Douglas, Zuzanna, exploring the arms control non-proliferation implications, ballistic and cruise missiles, and also the history and doctrine of Russia's use of these systems. We've got about 30 minutes for Q&A, so please do, the online audience, put your questions into that Q&A function. Maybe I can sort of just kick things off by talking about something that's been in the news on and off, of course, as the war has carried on beyond, I think it's safe to say, Russia's initial aspirations for its campaign, and that's about defence industrial capacity. I wonder, Douglas and Tim, if you can say a little bit about what are we seeing about the peaks and troughs in Russian use, particularly things like cruise missiles. We're seeing now some stories coming out about saving them for the winter for CNI targets and things like that. What have we seen in evidential terms that gives us any indication of the stresses and strains that may exist on Russia's defence industry in production? Maybe Douglas first, and then Tim, if you want to say a few words about that.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I'll start, and then Tim can add some additional comment. I think there's clearly an issue in terms of inventory depth with both 101 and 3M14. Part of the challenge in any kind of assessment is we don't actually know what the holdings were before the invasion. We don't know what the production rates actually are for either of those systems, either before the war or now. There are obviously sort of elements around the use that suggests that they don't have enough, that they are trying to harbour and manage the stock and the production rate. I mean, I think in the last couple of months, it's very difficult to discern any significant use of air-launched cruise missiles, for instance. It's unclear that there have actually been any raids of any significance. The suspicion is that the Russians are building up a stock to go again against critical national infrastructure and quite possibly the power infrastructure as the winter really kicks in. In terms of other things that you can observe, the head of KTRV, the guided weapons conglomerate in Russia, has already said that they are, on 2 or 3 shifts at the main missile producing facilities. Whether or not that's allowed them to get back to the kind of production rates they had prior to the war, I think is an open question. Also, the extent that they've had to do import substitution or to find second sources of components and subsystems that the access was cut off from. They're certainly managing to make additional 3M14s and Ka-101s. The big question is just how many are they managing to make? Tim?
Thanks, Doug. Indeed, as Doug says, I mean, it's very difficult to assess production numbers. Potentially as a yardstick, if looking at the way in which the Russian army replaced Tochka-U with Iskander, you were looking potentially at sort of production numbers between around 30 to 50 missiles per year, looking at the way that they were upgrading brigades. You can take that as a very rough yardstick, perhaps, and then you could wonder then, as Doug has pointed out, with the needs to improve production, has that number potentially been increased? If you think for each launcher which is capable of, and I'm thinking of Iskander here, it's capable of launching two missiles. If you think about what comparative armed forces have in terms of the size of their short-range ballistic missile arsenal, so if we look at China, for instance, the China military power reports came out around 2 weeks or so ago, and in that I think it lists that there are around 250 SRBM launchers and around 1,000 missiles, so indicating around 4 reloads per launcher. You could potentially use that as a yardstick for what we could assess the numbers of missiles that Russia might have had in its inventory. I would be surprised if Russia had double digits of reloads for each one of these launchers, but it's certainly going to be more than 1 or 2. Yeah, I think perhaps I'll leave it at that. I think there's a lot of room for speculation. The Ukrainian MOD sometimes release figures, they say, of how many missiles the Russians have left in their inventory. It's just very difficult to do any sort of independent analysis and assessment of those figures.
Okay, Tim, that's great. Thank you. I'll give you a couple that have come in online, if that's okay, but I'll let you think about it for a minute and then ask Zuzanna a quick question. But so one first from Thomas Newdick. What evidence have you seen of domestically developed ballistic missile systems from the Ukrainian side? And what do you think we might see in the future? And from Yannick Jameau, I didn't hear a mention of Grom 2. Can you say anything about what you've seen in that regard? So, and while you're thinking about that, and a couple of difficult questions there, Zuzanna, all this, the use that Douglas and Tim were talking about there, and the stresses and strains, yes, but Russia's still using and employing these systems. What about the effect on its strategy of integrated air and missile defense? What difference is that starting to make?
Right. Yeah, of course. We obviously have seen some reporting of Ukrainian air defense intercepting quite a lot of, especially subsonic cruise missiles. They did fare a little bit worse with HRBMs. But I think those kind of initial lessons can already provide a bit of a suggestion that this can potentially complicate Russian planning. And I think, one thing that Russia will be taking from this is that the improvement, to speed and stealth and maneuverability of their missiles is going to be of paramount importance. But just in terms of how this may affect the actual strategy, it will depend on what happens in Europe now. And I'm just going to caveat this with it just quite difficult to see how you can plausibly and economically cover a wide area with area missile defense to the so that's actually useful. But it's definitely going to have produce some questions for the Russians, such as, do we need to use an increased number of missiles in our conventional strikes? And if that kind of becomes a bit too expensive to do, then will that lower threshold for nuclear use? Right? And so these are the questions that Russia will have to start grappling with, and probably is already. But like I said, this is thinking for potential NATO conflict, most likely.
There's also the doctrinal question, I suppose, of as we were covering in those presentations of integration of UAS, and the value in that in terms of swamping systems. Tim.
Great, thank you, James, and thank you, Tom and Yannick, for the questions. I mean, maybe I'll take them together. So yeah, evidence of Ukrainian indigenous ballistic missile capabilities, and with reference maybe to Grom 2. So of course, Grom began its development around 2013. Was reportedly being developed for Saudi Arabia as a potential customer. And it's likely also, of course, that would have then been integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces to replace Tochka, much in the same way that Iskander was replaced. The Russian MOD have claimed to have intercepted several Grom 2 missiles. There's been they've then given no visual evidence to support those claims. We haven't seen any imagery of the Ukrainian SRBM that looks anything different to Tochka. Or a Western supplied piece of equipment launching the ATACMS. You can see how it'd be in Ukraine's interest at some point to have its own capabilities. Whether it can do this in wartime, I think, would be quite difficult. Of course, needing to disperse across different sites in order so that no site is targeted. The production of those pieces of equipment, how do you bring it into the country during wartime, and so on, might be quite difficult. So I would say that I haven't seen any evidence of Grom 2 being used by Ukraine. We've seen a TEL system some time ago. How far the missile got into development is uncertain. Ukrainian sources say that the missile's production was halted after a couple of years. For a couple of years, but it had since been restarted. I believe there was an espionage case where a Ukrainian citizen was arrested for supplying Russia with information on Grom 2 around a year or so ago. So it seems that it's still alive and kicking, but whether it's actually the Ukrainians are actually able to produce any systems, I'm quite doubtful. If they had such systems, I think that there wouldn't have been such a demand from them for ATACMS. And also, of course, we would have seen evidence of Ukrainian strikes against Russian targets that are beyond the range of the M30. And potentially as well, we would have seen the Ukrainians use those missiles in ways that they couldn't have or wouldn't have used them with ATACMS. Presumably, the United States has put quite strict conditions on how ATACMS could be used. the Americans had significant fears of escalation with giving Ukraine ATACMS. So perhaps there are restrictions on you cannot use this weapon to target Russian territory, for instance. And if you do so, then the supply might be limited or halted completely. Presumably, though, if the Ukrainians had their own system, which was capable of reaching targets around 300 kilometers or more into Russia, the Ukrainians would have been more willing to use it in a way that the Americans might have seen as being escalatory. Because we haven't seen that, I would then suggest that means that, you know, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. But if we haven't heard or any quacking, then I think that there hasn't been any GROMs produced or used. Thank you.
Tim, thanks. A reference I wasn't expecting in this webinar. Thanks. Just a number of questions coming in, but I'll just keep on the equipment side if I can. There's one for Douglas, again from Thomas Newdick. He says he'd be interested to hear your thoughts on claims of Russian use of denuclearized versions of Kar-55SM make up for conventional LACM shortfalls. And then there's another one from Tom McCain, a broader question about NATO and IMD that I'll get to and maybe direct first at William. But Douglas on Kar-55.
Yeah, Tom, I should probably mention the decoy 55, as it were. Yeah, it does look like they have used the 55 with the nuclear device removed and size and mass representative shape inserted instead. Pretty much in a sense, in the same way that they've employed the Shahed 136 Garand 2, if you like, which is just to try and overwhelm Ukrainian ground-based air defence, just to complicate the defensive picture that much more by putting more things in the air that look like either direct attack munitions or in the case of the 55 SM, a cruise missile. Interesting that we haven't, as far as I can tell, seen the 555. That may be indicative either that the stock of 55 SMs is low, so they don't have very many left to convert, or that the conversion process itself was demanding, and that actually the quicker win from a Russian perspective is to turn 55 SMs into a decoy.
Douglas, thanks. I'll just now go to the question is from Tom McCain, the next question here. So the balance of investment question. Given the relative performance of missiles and missile defences, is it possible to draw any conclusions about whether NATO should prioritise acquisition of more long-range precision strike or strengthen its IAMD? Maybe William first, and then Doug or Tim or Zuzanna, if you want to come in on that, but William first.
I think the answer is yes. Obviously, there's a huge shortfall at NATO on integrated air and missile defense, particularly on mobile longer range air defense systems. I think the lesson from Ukraine is that you actually can do a whole lot against cruise and ballistic missiles. I think if you went back 5-10 years ago, there was a degree of fatalism where they said, well, we can't detect and we can't really stop cruise missiles, so what's the point in investing? Ukraine has proven you can. And so that, combined with Russia's announcement that they're going to move nuclear weapons onto Belarusian territory for delivery against NATO targets, even further means that around Kaliningrad and around the Belarusian border, we really need to have more forward deployed integrated air and missile defense. Obviously, long-range precision strike is important, but I think everybody knew that beforehand. Everybody knew that, and the entire alliance finally acknowledged that when they acknowledged that Russia had violated the INF treaty systematically with the 9M729. We need more, better, longer-range fires, but I think there already are a number of solutions in train, such as PRSM, an Army 1,000-kilometer range missile. There's a number of solutions that are in train here, but for integrated air and missile defense, you have the Sky Shield initiative from Germany. But I think as an alliance, we need to get a lot more serious about purchasing and deploying these systems. And it's not something that you invest in and you lose that investment. These are systems that can last for quite some time. And knitting together those radars and those air defenses in a smart way can really safeguard the alliance and take a tool away from Russia in terms of both warfighting, but also in terms of intimidation. And the sooner we do that, I think the better off the NATO alliance will be.
I just had a couple of thoughts, Tom. I mean, first of all, I think we collectively need to get better at weapon target matching. I think one of the things that Ukraine has shown is that you can expend very, very high-end SAMs like Patriot against very low-cost targets for absolutely legitimate reasons. If the choice is between letting a threat system through or shooting it down with a high-end, high-value, high-cost system, then you're going to take the shot and try and work out the finances later. I don't. In terms of the balance of investment question in the round, I don't think it's an either or. It's a case of both. And in a way, you can kind of look at long-range conventional precision strike as part of integrated air and missile defence. I mean, the best place to engage a missile, be it a cruise missile or a ballistic weapon in any form, is while it's still in the ground. So you kind of that left the launch thing. So I think there is it's a nuggety, difficult problem which needs to be addressed in the round, as it were, rather than kind of saying more of this and less of that.
Zuzanna, Tim, anything to add on that?
Not really, no.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, in terms of long range, I agree. It's not an either or. It's a both. Thinking of from the ballistic side of the house, that is certainly happening. If you think 10 years ago, amongst European NATO members, it was Greece and Turkey that possessed a ground-launched ballistic missile. Now that number, I think, is either in or very much approaching double digits. Considering as well that when many Eastern European countries joined NATO, including Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, they had to get rid of their short-range ballistic missiles as a condition for joining NATO. Now many of those countries are either possess them already or are trying to procure them. I think it also highlights then the utility of interoperable platforms and HIMARS, M142 HIMARS, and also the M270 MLRS. Now these these platforms, they can be used, of course, for launching sort of shorter range M30 rockets, but they can also be used then also to launch TACMs, and also eventually its replacement, the PrISM. PrISM Block 1, or Increment 1 as it's called, will have a 499 kilometer range. Plus, indeed, yeah, which was originally put in place for the INF Treaty until that became defunct. The United Kingdom is certainly buying PrISM. That's been the first European country which has expressed its interest. The United Kingdom hasn't had a ground-launched ballistic missile capability since the 1990s. And I think that because you can see so many countries in Europe that are acquiring these platform types, it then also then gives the possibility of you've got ATACMS today, but tomorrow you might have PrISM. So I think that there's sort of further room to upgrade capabilities in the future as well, which is handy. It doesn't require a whole new platform and a missile. It's just a new missile and then integrating it into the platform. Thank you.
Tim, thanks. So there's one here from Nicholas Aber talking about sort of blending the two, really, air defense and missile capability. Saying, maybe it's one for Douglas in terms of the IAMD side. Is there any preliminary assessments, given the reports from the Ukrainian side of intercepts of Kinzhals, is there any preliminary assessment of the efficacy, let's say, of high-speed weapons like that, hypersonic ballistic missiles, versus the current generation of air defense systems?
I think it's a fascinating question, and I'd love to know a definitive answer myself. I think one of the difficulties with that is that obviously it's separating fact from not fiction, but from the propaganda element. I mean, a question in my mind, and Tim, I may have a view in this as well, is if we assume that Kinzhal was hit, then the question is how many Patriots were expended to destroy a single missile. You would assume normally with something like Patriot, it's a double tap. You launch two to probably try and ensure some kind of kill. If it was more than that, and there are some suggestions that it was perhaps significantly more, and that the Ukrainian utilization rate of Patriot was particularly high, then obviously that becomes more problematic in the sense that your risk is you become involved or embroiled in an attritional fight where you're basically trying to overmatch defenders' missiles with your offensive capability. And it doesn't just have to be ballistic. Obviously, you then get into this issue where you have low, slow, very low cost systems, subsonic cruise, perhaps supersonic and hypersonic weapons in the cruise regime in the fullness of time, and then ballistic systems as well, all coming at you. And you can't just address that with having very, very high-end, high-cost SAMs. You need to be able to do those or address that kind of spectrum of threats in a cost-effective manner.
Thank you. We've got about 5 or so minutes left, so I would encourage the online audience to send in further questions. But maybe I can ask one of perhaps Zuzanna and Douglas first. Zuzanna, in your presentation, you talked about weaknesses in Russian ISR and BDA, battle damage assessment. What do you think explains that? I mean, we know the failure to gain air superiority is one reason. Is you can't then have Air Force battle damage assessment, perhaps a reliance on space-based systems or something like that. But what do you think that Russia will be taking away from its challenge? And Tim highlighted this problem, given the visuals he displayed, the slides he displayed of incremental strikes, but a lack of follow-up. Things like that could be explained by stock problems, but also it could be explained by challenges in getting efficient BTA. What's your sense of what Russia might take away from this and what it can do? And maybe Doug on the practical side.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has kind of become apparent is that Russia has kind of shown that it's still using like a very formulaic targeting practice and cycle, and rather than and just kind of a personal problem where you just don't react fast enough and you don't have the right flexibility. There isn't quite quick enough communication between different various teams about targeting and then disseminating that information. So I think that's one of the big areas where there needs to be quite a bit of improvement. But I think Doug will be able to talk about the practical side a bit more.
Yeah, I just suppose what Zuzanna said. I mean, the Shoigu alluded to problems in the targeting cycle in Syria. Excuse me, when it came to land attack cruise missile use, and he suggested that these were being addressed. Obviously, he suggested they've been addressed completely successfully, but I think there's an open question as to the extent that that all of the shortcomings, if you like, have been fully met. I think more generally, there's a lack of geospatial ISR. Why is that? Well, it's because the bottom fell out of defence expenditure with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and really there was a decade plus of significant underinvestment in geospatial. Similarly, in terms of air-breathing ISR, it's the same problem. There are far fewer platforms than certainly if you look at the US. And it's something that I think Russia is now painfully aware of, and will be, one, scrambling to address in the immediate term, and two, in any kind of post-conflict analysis, beginning to figure out how they address these shortcomings more fully in the medium term.
Douglas, thanks. I think we've got time for a couple more. I'll ask one more from the floor, and then I'll ask one final question to William. William, I'll give you time to think about this, if you can. You were talking, of course, about MTCR and the challenges with the current regime. What would be your prescription for improving that? Let's say 3 or 4 points where you think that regime can really practically be adapted, given the challenges, of course, with the organizational structure and status of the organization and how decisions are reached, that sort of thing. But for Zuzanna, on the question's really about Russian-Iranian links, and Ryan Bullard talking about in future, will we see any form of more coordination, cooperation between the two? Will Russia look to outsource? Could it look to outsource some low-end systems to countries like Iran to focus on high-end systems itself? And that brings us to, I suppose, the broader question of cooperation. We've talked about Shaheds and Garans in Russian service, but evident links with North Korea that have developed in terms of, we've seen grad rounds coming from that country. What can we see about the possible directions of not just Iranian-Russian cooperation, but North Korean-Russian cooperation on ammunition?
Thank you very much. Yeah, when it comes to Iran, obviously the major thing that happened recently is that the United Nations Security Council Resolution number 2231, the provisions that impose some limits on Iranian missile activity and also missile exports, that has expired on the 18th of October. And there has been obviously Iran has not ceased to develop its missiles. To the contrary, it also has proliferated those missiles in the region locally. But there's a degree of evidence to suggest that those exports have not extended outside of the region. Perhaps because of political and legal considerations. So it's definitely something that has been in the news quite a lot. I think Shoigu has recently traveled to Iran, and there is a degree of worry that there will be some more extensive cooperation in the realm of missiles. And Russia could definitely be interested in several of Iran's SRBMs. Also potentially some cruise missiles as well, which could be accompanied by Iranian UAVs to be more effective. And of course, Iran seems to have quite a lot of production capacity. So these could be potentially substantial numbers that could really add some firepower to Russian missile campaigns. When it comes to North Korea, we have seen obviously some reports of some sort of initial potential intelligence that there are signs that North Korea is preparing some deliveries to Russia of its SRBMs. But this is obviously very much unconfirmed. These are just signs. And when you think about what North Korea might really want to give Russia, it's not that clear at all. When you look at, say, the KN-23, it's a missile that is based on Iskander, but it's much larger, right? It requires, I believe, a different tail. So there's really just not quite a lot of clarity of whether North Korea has just enough production capacity and just the right missiles to provide to Russia. But
thanks. So before we go to William, Douglas, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, Zuzanna pointed out the Russian military delegation visit to Iran. I think it was interesting to see what the Russians were showing, which included the 351, which is a cruise missile, which the Iranians have already supplied to the Houthi, and also the 358, which is the rather curious loitering SAM, which again has been supplied to the Houthi and perhaps others, and has been used successfully in combat. So I think that's kind of indicative of perhaps how the Iranians are thinking about what they might want to try and interest Moscow in. And the obvious question that you raise is, what might Moscow actually want to get from Tehran?
Douglas, thanks. William, before I turn to you on the MTCR point, Yannick Jabot's got an addition on that. He says, sorry, I may have misunderstood per sound on my side about increasing the scope of MTCR to high-end missiles. Would it threaten the legal base of US-UK leasing arrangement on Polaris, Poseidon, Tridents? Question mark. A question mark. I leave you to respond to the question mark.
Yeah, that's a great question, but I mean, I think what we're seeing in terms of destabilizing missiles, you're talking about stealth and speed on cruise, and this gets back to a point I was making before. If we assume that Russia's nuclear doctrine includes getting KH-102s from Tupolev 95 Bears and other platforms to a target with a nuclear warhead, and they have this concept of dosing, so using a small number of nuclear weapons in order to sober up your adversary. If they don't think the KH-102 can get through, because as we've seen with the KH-101, it doesn't always get through, and so they don't fire 3 or 4 to make sure that one hits the target. If they have to fire 10 or 15 to make sure that one hits the target, that doesn't look like a limited strike. So I have some big questions there, but on MTCR, I do think looking at the higher end, higher speed, stealthy cruise missiles is going to be something that's really interesting. You could modify the MTCR to do that. I would also recommend you take a look. We did a paper, I did a paper for the IISS called Revitalizing Arms Control, the MTCR Hague Code of Conduct. You can find that online. Tim Wright and I did a paper focusing on the MTCR itself. I would recommend you look at that. But I do think we need to adapt the MTCR not to older ballistic missile models, but again, towards the higher end cruise missile models that may actually be destabilizing in regional conflicts. Because honestly, as I mentioned, if the subsonic cruise missile becomes something that is less viable and therefore less destabilizing conflicts, maybe we stop trying to limit things that we're having a very bad time limiting anyway, and we focus more on the higher end capabilities that are actually destabilizing, which I wouldn't put US-UK cooperation on sub-launch ballistic missiles in that basket. Thanks, Jan. Good to hear from you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we're out of time. I think we're actually over time. So thanks very much for everyone for joining online on Friday afternoon. I think it's been a really rich discussion, covered a significant amount of ground. If you haven't yet read the report, I'll just hold it up in front of the camera. It's freely available on IISS.org. You can download it and print it and read it and get the assessments on paper of the team that delivered them verbally today. But I'd very much like to thank my colleagues Zuzanna, Douglas, Tim and William joining from Berlin. And have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.